What are Lunar Iuno's biggest pros and cons? That's what I'm here to tell you today. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. So the main thing that has changed since Iuno's release is, before I thought our DPS team was going to be more of a side thing you could do, just something for the simps, not really anything major. No, that's just completely wrong now. No, she is genuinely one of the most competitive DPSs in the game, assuming that you have Lenny, because oh my goodness gracious, this character is insane, not to mention that Mornier is more than likely probably going to be an upscale to that team. Yeah, DPS Iuno is actually kind of insane. It's also a team that I personally just find very fun, but focusing on the meta value here, she is absolutely crazy as an Aero DPS. I would say if you haven't invested into Cardathea yet, Iuno is honestly just going to be a cheaper investment for you at this point, because that way you can pull for Lenny, who is a ridiculously universal support. I could not emphasize enough how universal that character is, and then you can also invest into Iuno, a character that is not only a really good heavy attack support, but also a really freaking good Aero DPS. And mind you, you don't even need her signature weapon in order to play her as a DPS. It definitely makes it better, sure, but you are still going to be comfortably clearing TOA, even if you're using other 5-star gauntlets options. Like, seriously, she is a nonsensically strong Aero DPS, and that is on top of being very easy to play. Her rotation is not that hard to learn at all. So she is nonsensically strong while also being accessible, and she is just ridiculous in TOA. I will say her wave clear isn't great in Whimpering Wastes. She can still clear it, but she's not exactly one of the best options there. But I will say that in TOA, she is some prime pick type stuff. She is absolutely amazing as an Aero DPS. And if you haven't already gotten an Aero DPS by this point, just go for this character. She is the better pick. Trust me on this one. She is cheaper than a negative status character. You can go for a universal support in the meantime, and she is ridiculously strong. You're not going to be disappointed in the performance whatsoever, and she is unironically one of the best DPSs in the game if you do have her signature weapon and you do have Lenny. Now, I will add something that is assuming you have her Sig, and I'm not calling her the best DPS in the game in general, but I am saying that she is one of the best, and her damage is actually ridiculously good for what it is. Her S6 is supposed to stabilize her DPS rotation, so I don't know if Kuro intended for her to be this good of a DPS at S0, but here we are. She just does a bonkers amount of damage, and you unironically could pull for Iuno with the intent of using her as a main DPS. Like, that is a completely valid and justified thing that you could do. Another thing is that she is an excellent heavy attack support, so not only can she literally just be pulled as a main DPS, but she's also a really nice second slot teammate for characters like Gion, obviously best in slot for Augusta, and basically any heavy attack character. She is the prime investment for them. I will say, pulling her for Gion makes a lot of sense. He could definitely use the help, but in Augusta's case, you could get away with just using Mortefi, and I'll talk about that a bit more later, but the point does stand that if you want to invest into heavy attack characters, Iuno is your gal. She is the woman to go for. Really good heavy attack support, and generally, a big part of her support isn't so much in her outro skill, as much as it's just the fact that she does a crap ton of damage, so there's also that factor to it. She's just nonsensically strong. It's honestly kind of funny. Another thing that I mentioned earlier is that she's not Sig-Reliant. Her signature weapon is very good, I don't mean to undersell it, and it is still a worthwhile pull if you're interested in a top performance Iuno. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that she is still a worthwhile pull, even if you're unable to get her signature weapon. You're still really going to feel the value of her on your account, and she's still going to be a very strong DPS for you, or a strong sub DPS. And see, that's the main thing I find quite nice here. This is mostly if you're playing her as a main DPS, because if you're playing her as a sub DPS, this point matters even less. But as a main DPS, yeah, you genuinely don't have to have her Sig. It's great to have, and it is an upgrade, but I think that just because Iuno's damage is so high at a baseline, she can still clear very comfortably without it, so it is one of those signature weapons where, honestly, you can pass on it for now. Maybe it will be good to get down the line if we do eventually start to get better Aero DPSs and she does start to fall off, but oh man, I wouldn't worry about her falling off for a while. So yeah, generally not signature weapon reliant, and if you're playing her as a sub DPS, matters even less. Still good to have, and I will say it does depend, because for example, the way she helps Gion is by doing a lot of a team's damage. So it's not just that she's buffing him, but also that she's doing a lot of damage herself. so it is always a safe investment to make your Iuno do more damage. You can see how she ended up being a great DPS in the end, right? But regardless, it still ends up being a situation where you don't really require the signature weapon. It's great to have, but I wouldn't really call it a requirement. Another thing that I should mention is that she has very varied teams. Yes, you can play DPS Iuno with Linny, and that is undeniably going to be her strongest DPSing team, but you can still play it with Shakona, and that is going to be plenty strong. Or even with Yinlin. Anybody who buffs her in any meaningful way can allow her to play as a main DPS, and it's going to be quite strong. Another thing is that, like I said, she is a great heavy attack support. Any main DPS that uses heavy attacks can utilize Iuno quite nicely. So this results in a situation where pulling for this one character gives you a boatload of teams. I feel like it's very rare where you're going to be in a circumstance where you're not going to have any place to use your Iuno. Now granted, I will say one thing, she doesn't really have many 4-star teammates, so this is provided that you've pulled a decent array of limited characters, and there may be some limited character rosters that might not really have a use case for Iuno, but if you pull for Linny, well then congratulations, you found a use case for her. Let her nuke TOA for you. She is a really, really reliable unit. So she is completely covered in terms of variety, and that's another thing that she has over Cardathia in my opinion as an Aero DPS. And another thing is that she can heal. This point, in my opinion, is a bit smaller because it only really matters if you're taking a lot of damage, but it is undeniably comfortable, and I'll say that she's honestly a really comfy character to do holograms with, because she is able to heal you throughout the course of your rotation. In my experience, it's not as extreme as Brandt, but she does still very much heal you, and it's very nice. It's just overall some extra comfort. And the nice thing is, you don't really have to go out of your way to get healing out of her, so it's just kind of a part of her natural rotation. You only really use the shields move if you're playing Augusta, but otherwise, even if you're not using that, you still get plenty of healing. It's quite nice. On the note about holograms, while this isn't a reason to get her or anything, it's just something I find personally funny. There are times where she can fly up really, really high on a boss's level so she doesn't get hit by their attacks, and she can just kind of shoot them in midair. It doesn't always happen, but when it does happen, it's quite amusing. She can fly up quite high to do her attacks. And that's another thing, I just personally find her quite fun because she's such an aerial character, but I would say gameplay fun just kind of varies from person to person. However, there are some flaws to her. I will say this flaw that I'm about to mention is probably the biggest deal breaker in regards to Iuno, but otherwise, she is a very valuable pull, and that is that she has no real 4-star second slot teammates. If you're pulling for Iuno as a main DPS, you basically have to have one of her 5-star supports, and if you're playing her as a second slot teammate, well then you also need to have one of the 5-star main DPSs that she can play with. And both of her best DPS supports, being Linny and Shakona, are running in the first half of this patch. So if you're watching this before Iuno's banner, then those two are not going to be running at the same time as Iuno if you suddenly change your mind about DPS Iuno when Iuno's already on. And if you're watching this in the future, well, you're gonna have to wait a hot minute before you can play DPS Iuno at her strongest. I guess there's Yinlin, but that character just isn't really worth investing into in general, so you'd rather just wait for a Linny rerun is my advice. That, or I would pull Augusta so you have someone to use her with if you really want to use Iuno and you have no one to use her with, but that's quite a big investment. I'd say if you don't have any teammates for Iuno right now, because both of her best DPSing teammates are just not going to be on the same half as her, I'd honestly just skip her this time around. Like I said, this is the biggest deal breaker in regards to this character. She is so good and inherently has very few flaws, but unfortunately, she's not budget friendly in the sense of teammates. She is still definitely a lot more bang for your airstrikes than plenty of other characters, but I would say there's a difference between being accessible and having high bang for your airstrikes. And you might say, well, this is pretty obvious because, well, we don't really have a lot of 4-stars in the game. And while that's true, somehow, despite this, plenty of characters do still end up having decent 4-star options. Frolova has Dungeon, Augusta has Mortefi, even Galbrina can use Mortefi, and then this one's a bit more niche, but DPS Choyuan can also use Mortefi, though that's me speaking from personal experience. So, all around, I would say if you don't have any of her 4-star teammates, you're in a bit of a precarious position, and if you were not already planning to pull for Augusta, then I'd honestly just pass on her this time around. Unless you're getting her for Gion, in which case, still a very good investment. Though I hope you did pick up Shakona as well, so that you can have the full Gion hyper team. Now, with that being said, she only has one more real flaw, and that is that for Augusta in particular, the character she was designed for, She's honestly surprisingly replaceable. She does have a buff within her kit, but only Augusta is able to reliably proc. But with that in mind, she's still not really that much of an upgrade over Mortefi. She's an upgrade. She is definitively better. And I will say she is still a good pull for Augusta, and definitely still a good upgrade. But it's more of a case where if you're a free-to-play, you can pass on it. If you're a low spender, it's a nice upgrade to get. That's kind of the way I see it. If you're really going for her just for Augusta, keep in mind it's a good upgrade, but I wouldn't really call it a groundbreaking upgrade. But it's a nice one either way, and I would say if you're really passionate about Augusta, then yes, it's worth it. But I'm more so just saying you don't really need to pull her as a specific support for Augusta. She's one of the most free-to-play friendly carries in the game. I would take advantage of that if I were you. Just in terms of pulls management at least. But either way, Iuno ends up being a ridiculously strong character with a ton of teams that ended up being a hilariously strong DPS. Genuinely, I think it's so funny how this all panned out, and I had no idea that back when I was just pulling a heavy attack support, that she would eventually become a ridiculously strong DPS on my account. I'm not gonna say strongest Aero DPS because I have a Choyuwen with sequences and he's my main DPS, but you get the point. Either way, it's a strong DPS on my account, and I'm pretty happy about how this all panned out, to be honest. It's pretty funny. Hopefully this video was able to tell you Iuno's biggest pros and cons. This has been Juice, signing out, and never underestimate the prowess of a high damaging second slot, I suppose.